Good day, and welcome to Whittier Trust's Actionable Ideas Conference Call. At this time, all participants are in a listen-only mode. If you would like to ask a question, please enter it at any time in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen, and the presenters will answer them at the end of the presentation. I would now like to turn the call over to David Dahl, Whittier Trust President and CEO. You may begin.
Thank you, Kat. Good morning, and thank you for joining us today for Whittier's webinar, The Next 90 Days on the Front Line of COVID-19 Research and the Economic Impact of the Pandemic. I'm David Dahl, President of Whittier Trust. Our health, the health of our families, and the health of our economy are intertwined. One directly impacts the other. Whittier Trust is proud of our partnership with the J. David Gladstone Institute, one of the world's preeminent medical research institutions. We are honored to have my friend Deepak Srivastava, president of the Institute, with us today. Deepak will give us firsthand medical insight into COVID-19, its impact on our health, and the research being conducted for a therapy or cure. Caleb Silsby, Senior Vice President and Chief Portfolio Manager at Whittier Trust, will address the economic devastation caused by the pandemic and its impact on employment and economic growth. He will discuss the policy actions taken by the Federal Reserve and U.S. Treasury and how these actions have impacted valuations of fixed income, real estate, and the stock market. Deepak, welcome, and thank you for being part of the webinar today.
Thank you, David. It's a pleasure to be here with you and the rest of your group from Whittier. We've had a long-standing, very fruitful partnership with Whittier Trust, and we're very grateful for that over the years. I'm delighted to be doing this webinar with Caleb to talk about both the virus and the economic effects, because from the very beginning of this pandemic, I have been making the point that dealing with people's health care and the economy are not at odds with one another, yet rather they're intertwined. If we do the right things for people's health, the economy in the longer term will prosper because we'll be able to get everybody back to work and get the economy more fully open. And so what I'd like to do today in advance of Caleb's comments is to share with you some of the things that are going on the innovation front to try to get us to the point where we can more fully open our economy and really overcome this coronavirus so we can get back closer to a normal state. And of course, normal in the future is going to be different than the past. There are many things from this coronavirus that even once we defeat it, the world will have changed fundamentally. And I think we should all acknowledge that. Now, before I do that, let me just, the Gladstone Institutes, where I serve as president, may be new to some of you, and we have had this a long partnership with Whittier. And so I just wanted to say a word about what we are. We are a nonprofit biomedical research institute located in San Francisco in the Mission Bay campus, next to the Mission Bay campus of the University of California of San Francisco. And our mission is to do the science and discovery science that will overcome many of humankind's unsolved diseases that still are ravaging and killing people all over the world. And unfortunately, with modern medicine, even today, there are far too many of those. We're not very large. We're about 500 people total. We focus our efforts in teams around specific areas, including cardiovascular disease, neurodegenerative diseases, immunologic disorders, and viral diseases. And our virologists, over the last 5 months or so, have completely pivoted their work, largely from HIV to this new coronavirus. And so, too, have many of our other investigators, as I'll mention to you in a moment. Now, I want to make the point that whatever we're doing today needs to be done with an outlook of tomorrow, because this isn't the first coronavirus, even in this century, to raise alarm. As all of you know, SARS and MERS had gotten a lot of attention, and those are also coronaviruses, as are about a third of all the colds, common colds that we get. And SARS and MERS, even though they got so much press, you can see here the number of people who were infected and died from that in the world were actually quite small. In contrast, already in a short period, the number of infected and dead in the world with coronavirus are really remarkable. 775,000 now dead in the world. About 20 to 25% of those are in the United States, both the number of cases as well as the number of deaths. Now, the reason this virus is causing so much havoc is that unlike many other viruses that might affect just one or two parts of the body, typically the lungs, this virus seems to be affecting lots of different organs in our body. The infection causes its first symptoms often in the lungs, but also sometimes with affecting your sense of smell. And we now know that this virus can affect the heart quite significantly, and that's contributing to the higher mortality than other viruses. The intestines, your brain. You've been probably hearing in the news about COVID fog. We're understanding that many people are having long-standing effects in all these organs from the virus or the body's immune response to the virus. So this is really affecting the whole body, and that's what's contributing to its both more high morbidity as well as mortality. Now, when this pandemic hit, if we look back, it went from it being there being 0 cases of death on a daily basis from this virus to by the middle of April, on April 16th, there were more people dying in our hospitals every day from COVID-19 than the next 5 most common causes of death combined. That's all heart disease patients, all cancer patients, accidents, et cetera. So that is really remarkable, from 0 to this in a matter of weeks, really. Now, this day was a blip. More of the days were about 2,500 deaths at the peak in this period. And that's when we shut down the economy at great expense, great cost, as you all know better than most. And the result of that was that we did reduce what we call the reproductive rate, or the R number, that's associated with this virus in all the states, virtually all the states in the United States. And this graph you're seeing here is a measure of that reproductive rate, or R. And that just means that if somebody's infected with the virus, that's how many people they will transmit it to. And before the shutdown, is probably around 4 or 5 people, each infected person. And the goal is to get that below 1. If you're below 1, then eventually a virus will burn itself out because it's not being transmitted enough. And so you can see here, by the beginning of June, after we'd shut down, just before or as the economies were opening up in various states, we were below 1 in most of the states, and things were getting under control. This is a really remarkable graph. You'll see the next. This is what I'm going to show you is only 2 weeks later after we started opening up. This is now the reproductive rate, and above 1, again, remember, means it's going to keep spreading. And these are the states now, and you can see so many now are above 1, and this is just in 2 weeks. And so this is what happened at this time. We weren't masking well uniformly. We weren't probably taking all the right precautions, and the result of this event in June was manifested in case trends, if you look, where here we went up in number of cases to 20 to 30,000 per day. In March, we shut down the economy. That leveled out. It didn't come down far enough, and some might argue that had we stayed closed a little bit longer, that would have dropped. We started opening, and the numbers I showed you were from here in early June. And then a few weeks later, you see the result where we get up to 60 to 70,000 cases per day. And then, as you all know, we've been now better with masking and a little bit more aggressive, and this is starting to come down and flatten, but flatten at a very high level of about 50,000 new cases per day. And part of that is that we're testing better, of course, but even that doesn't account for most of it, because we know the percent of patients that are testing positive is much higher than it used to be. So it used to be below 5% or so, and now in some places that's been as high as 20%. but 7 to 8 to 10 on an average around the country. So the rate of spread has certainly gone up. So what have we done so far? We've taken public health measures to mitigate these consequences. So we need to test. We're testing a lot more, about 800,000 tests a day. We probably need to double or triple that, and we will. But ultimately, we need to be testing people in workplaces, schools, airports, those who are not ill, to limit spread. Once we detect people, we need to isolate them and trace their contacts and continue to maintain physical distancing. But probably the most important thing we can do is all wear masks, and that is in part because we now know that about 40% of people who are infected with this virus will never be symptomatic. They will never have symptoms. They'll be completely fine, but they're spreading and shedding the virus like anybody else who is sick. And now we know that about half of the spread that occurs is through people who are asymptomatic. So you sort of have to, until we can test broadly, you have to assume that everybody around you, unless you know otherwise, is spreading the virus, and you are too. And so that's why masking is so important. So these are all good public health measures. We need to do them, but they are not going to get rid of the virus. It's only mitigation. The only way we will get rid of this problem is to innovate our way out of this. And that's what I want to spend the rest of the time talking about today. And there are really three fronts where we need innovation. One is diagnostics, so we can tell more quickly and more efficiently who has the virus and who doesn't. We need new treatments, and if we can just get treatments that reduce the risk of death, that will fundamentally change the equation. And then ultimately, we need to prevent this through vaccines, and that's really what it's going to take to get past this. So let me talk a bit about each of these, and what I'll try to do is give you an idea of the landscape in each of these areas, and then give you a shorter, small vignette of some cutting-edge innovation that we're doing here at Gladstone in those areas. And as I mentioned earlier, much of Gladstone has pivoted to studying this, and at this time, about half of our faculty across all areas now are engaged in COVID-19 research at some level, and I'll touch on that a bit. So diagnostic testing right now involves two different areas. One is antibodies, which tells if you've had the infection in the past and your body mounted an immune response to this. The specificity of those tests are still not great, so they need to be improved. And the other concern with those tests is that it's now becoming clear that after about 3 months or so, in many cases, the antibody levels will decline significantly. That's not all bad. It doesn't mean that your immune system's not revved up and prepared, because you have a different part of your immune system known as T cells that come into play as well. The other type of testing is to test if you actually have the virus right now. And most of the tests that are on the market right now involve something known as PCR, which stands for polymerase chain reaction, which just means it's a way to amplify the genetic material of the virus. So you can make lots and lots of copies. That way you go from a tiny amount of the virus to a large amount that's easy to detect. And it's a good test, and it's about 90% accurate, which is good, but it does require a more sophisticated laboratory instrument, a trained user, and it needs to be done in a laboratory. And that's what's been causing a lot of the delays that you hear about in the news a lot, where a sample has to be sent. It takes a couple of days to get back, or a week even. And it's simply because it's a more complex test. Now, there are a number of companies trying to make a new kind of test that are based on something called CRISPR. And CRISPR is an acronym for a gene editing approach, where you can go in and correct any part of your genome that maybe has a mutation that's causing disease. But there's also a way to use the same machinery to detect the viral RNA that is present there, so the genetic material of the virus. And these tests are I think being developed rapidly, and they too, however, in most of the ones that are all the ones that are being developed, also still require amplification of the virus in order to get enough quantity to make it detectable by the test and still requires a laboratory instrument with a trained user. So what we really need, the type of test we really need, and many people are trying to find this right now to open up more, is a mobile test that can be deployed widely in the field, so schools, airports, workplaces, has high sensitivity and is low cost and is simple and can be done without being in a laboratory setting. And so I'm excited to share with you a test that we have developed here at Gladstone that does exactly those things. That's not ready yet to deploy, but should be very soon before the end of the year. And this was done by Melanie Ott, who's the director of our Virology Institute at Gladstone, and Dan Fletcher, who's a bioengineer at Berkeley, and Jennifer Doudna, who invented CRISPR technology, runs a lab at Gladstone and at Berkeley. We call this Rovier. And what this does is you can take a nasal swab just in the nostrils, directly put it into a cartridge that's preloaded with the machinery involving these CRISPR proteins that will detect the virus even without amplifying it. So just the small amounts that are there, it's sensitive enough to detect. And you put this cartridge into a device, and in a single step, it then reads out whether the virus is there or not. And the reason it can do that without amplifying is that we've adapted a smartphone camera to function like a very sophisticated, expensive microscope that would be this big in a laboratory. And it turns out that we're hoping that the smartphone camera would be just as sensitive as a big microscope. To our surprise, we found in the last few weeks that it's actually 10 times more sensitive than a big, expensive microscope, probably because of all the investment that's gone in cell phone smartphone camera technology. So it's this breakthrough of using the smartphone camera that makes it mobile and doesn't require amplification, making it sensitive enough. And then all the data is collected on your phone and through an app that's common. It could be worldwide. And so in real time, you have geolocation data about who has the virus, who their contacts may be, et cetera. So this is what this device is going to look like. Your phone just slips into this. A cartridge goes in here, and it can be handheld and be mobile. So we're very excited about this because it does address many of the things that I mentioned that we need to have in order to really test properly and limit the spread through effective testing. So we're hopeful that we'll be able to get FDA approval for this by later in the fall and have it more widely deployed by the end of the year, early next year. And please feel free to put any questions in the question bar at your bottom left, and we will have a little bit of time for questions towards the end. Now, what about treatments? So you don't even have to have a treatment that gets rid of this virus. If all we did is find a treatment that diminished the death rate so that if you got this, yes, you'd get really sick, but the likelihood of dying was very low, that would completely change how we approach this disease. And there are at least 2 therapies now in the last few months that we now know do help. And one of them is Remdesavir, which is a drug made by Gilead here in the Bay Area. And that drug inhibits replication of the virus, and it does shorten the symptoms from about 15 to 11 days in the sickest ICU patients. There's still a trial ongoing to see if it makes a bigger difference if you start it early, but it does help, but it's clearly not a silver bullet that really, but it is helpful. Hydroxychloroquine, of course, has been in the news a lot. You've heard our president talk about it a lot. I think there was initial excitement because in a dish, it did affect the virus, and so there was enthusiasm for this because it's 60, 70 years old. We know about this drug, but it's quite clear now from many trials that there's no benefit, at least in the sicker patients, with this drug. There's still trials about whether it might help if people take it very early, and those trials are still ongoing. I mentioned earlier that the immune system's overreaction to the virus is contributing significantly to the pathology and the deaths even. And so there's a drug called Actemra that's widely used with people with rheumatoid arthritis and other autoimmune conditions, and that's been tested now. And unfortunately, that turned out not to have very significant benefits. I think that's clear now, at least in its later stages. But very recently, a very exciting result came out where steroids, or dexamethasone, which is a type of steroid that also dampens the immune system, actually did reduce mortality by 30 to 40%, which is a lot, even in the sickest patients. And so that's become standard of care. It's cheap, it's safe, and so this is now being widely used. So those are drugs, and that's been helpful, but those are repurposing old drugs and hoping they work here. What we really need is to more directly test and screen for drugs specifically for this virus. And so that many are doing now, and I'll give you one example of how one can go about this. So this is what the virus looks like. It's got a number of these proteins on the surface that are called spike proteins. And it gets its coronavirus name from that because it's a crown around it. That spike protein, which is called, is what's used. It uses to interact with the receptor on the cell surface and enter the cell. And so if you could inhibit the virus from even entering the cell, which is what our antibodies do normally when our immune system mounts an antibody to it, then you could prevent entry. And one of our investigators, Warner Green, who is the founder of our Virology Institute, had discovered a great assay to screen for drugs for HIV entry that were widely used in the past. And he now is screening about 12,000 drugs that we've put together that have already gone through safety testing in humans for a variety of uses. If there's a hit that works, it goes immediately into a later stage clinical trial. So we're in the midst of that right now in our building to do exactly that. And this assay is also now being used to test for the plasma from patients who already had the infection and have antibodies, to see which antibodies from that plasma could affect entry, and to even screen for new antibodies that could be synthesized and used to prevent the infection. So all that is going on. Now, once a virus actually penetrates the cell and gets into the cell, then it has only two jobs. It has to make more copies of itself, and it has to package itself so it can spread to other cells and other people. That's it. That's its whole job. But a virus is actually just a bag of nucleic acids that code for things, but it has nothing else. So the only way it works is to hijack our own machinery in our cells to do its work. And the way it hijacks our machinery is it takes this nucleic acid in the virus, encodes for not that many, maybe fewer than 30 proteins. That's it. And those proteins then have to find and interact with our proteins and hijack them to do their work. And so if you could find all the human proteins that the virus proteins are interacting with, then that would tell you how it's working and how you might intervene to make it not work. So that's what we've done. So very quickly, Nevin Krogan and Melanie Ott cloned all the about 30 genes from the virus, made their proteins, and figured out all the different proteins that they interact with in our cells. And so schematically, what it looks like is something like this, where the virus has just these genes. We have 20,000. The virus then takes over our machinery. And the notion here is if you knew all those proteins from the human that were being hijacked, you could maybe have a drug that would break that interaction, and then the virus can do its thing. And so that's exactly what we're doing. So we've identified here in this red dot, it represents a virus protein. These yellow are all our human proteins that it interacts with. And we've actually found drugs now already that are predicted to break those interactions. And about 70 drugs look like they do that. And we're testing those systematically one by one. And we now know that some of them are even going to clinical trials. And we found that one of them, actually dextromethorphan, is in cough syrup. Actually looks like it actually helps the virus. And so we're studying now whether that's a bad thing for people to be taking, because you can imagine a lot of people would be taking that at that time. So that's a way we're trying to find drugs, new drugs for this. And then we have as I mentioned earlier, this virus seems to affect lots of different organs. So ideally, we'd want to know what are those proteins in those specific cells and how is it working in our lung cell, our heart cell, or brain cell. And fortunately, we can do that now because we can make from human stem cells all these different cell types, lungs, heart, gut, and we're doing exactly that. And what really has enabled that is a landmark discovery made by one of our investigators, Shinya Yamanaka, who actually is also the L.K. Whittier investigator at Gladstone, which we've been very grateful for. And he found a way to take adult cells and take them back in time, sort of hack the code so that they behave just like a human embryonic stem cell in an early embryo. And then we could use those to make all these different cells. And this was recognized by the Nobel Prize in 2012. And so we've used that to make different cell types in the human. And here I'm showing you actually heart cells. There's an article in the New York Times today about how many patients are suffering long-term heart damage from this virus. And it appears to attack the heart and is contributing to the mortality, but also the morbidity long-term. So what I'm showing you here are in green is marking these heart cells, and they have these lines that you see here. These are the contractile units that make the heart beat. And in red, you see here is a cell that's been infected with the virus. So these cells can get infected with the virus. And quite strikingly, what we've found is that in many cells, these units of these long strands that I showed you are getting chopped up. So here on the right, in a close-up, you'll see that there's just fragments of these lines together. It's because this contractile machinery is being chopped up somehow by infection with this virus, which we're now trying to understand. But we've now gone back to autopsy specimens and seen the exact same thing in human hearts from the organ. And so we're now trying to figure out why this is happening and how we could stop it. So that's an example of new treatment approaches. And then finally, before I close, I want to touch on where we are with prevention and vaccines. So this is really critical. And fortunately, there's been a worldwide effort on this. There are about over 120 vaccines being developed right now. Over a dozen are now in clinical trials already, several of them in the latest stages, what we call phase 3. And many of them are using brand new approaches that have never been tried before, and that's sped up development. So let me just give you a quick idea of the landscape. One new approach involves injection of what we call messenger RNA, which is just the nucleic acids that would encode for the spike protein that I mentioned to you. And the thought is our immune system would then recognize this virus protein and mount a response to it. There are two companies, Moderna and Pfizer with BioNTech, that are now in phase 3 trials that'll read out before the end of this year, so that's great. The United States has already spent several billion ordering hundreds of millions of doses of these virus in case they work. There's another approach where we deliver the spike protein with what we call an adenovirus, which is using just another virus to deliver the protein. And then there are several companies shown here that are now also getting ready for phase 3 trials. And these will read out a little bit later, but also very, very soon by the beginning of the year. And we've also invested over billions of dollars in acquiring some of those. And then there's also attempts where people are injecting just the straight DNA that would encode the spike protein. Those are in earlier phases. A company called Inovio is developing that. And then Novavax and Takeda together are developing a direct protein injection, and this is in an early stage, but we've also spent over $1.5 billion on that. So as you can see, there are many different approaches, and we don't know what'll work yet, but we're already placing bets on those in advance. Now, I wanted to close with sharing with you a completely different approach that one of our investigators at Gladstone has been developing for a vaccine that he had been developing for HIV for many years, that the Department of Defense has been funding. And it's a very clever and completely radical approach that basically takes advantage of the virus's ability to make more copies of itself and package itself, and turns the tables on it so that we're now hijacking that ability of the virus, but basically inactivating it so it can make more of itself and spread, but it's only spreading something that's inactive. And so what that looks like, something here that this is how he developed for HIV, is the normal HIV integrates into our genome. It makes copies of itself, packaged, and then goes and infects other cells. What he's made here that he calls therapeutic interfering particles, or TIPS, is basically a defective virus that can still make more copies of itself, still package and spread, but it doesn't do anything. So the beauty of this is that it actually spreads cell to cell, protecting neighboring cells, can spread people to people, protecting people, and that's actually how oral polio vaccine helped as well. And the reason that's valuable is when you think about the challenge of inoculating 7 billion people, or even 5 or 6 billion people, that's a huge manufacturing issue and distribution issue. If this works, then, at least for HIV, it was estimated that even if you're able to inoculate everybody for HIV, you would only protect a certain percent of the population that was relatively small. But with this approach, even 1% of individuals, if they're inoculating, they would spread it to enough people that there'd be broad protection in the population. And so this is being developed right now for this virus. The U.S. Army is funding a good part of this, and our hope is to be able to test this in human cells in addition, in mice, and then accelerate this to clinical trials before the end of the year. So in this vaccine area, I think one very good thing we're doing right now is this Operation Warp Speed that I mentioned earlier, that is through what we're buying hundreds of millions of doses even before we know whether any one of them will work. And the idea here is that we will potentially waste billions of dollars by doing that, but save time. We'll save time on production time, and so that if any one of them work, we'll be ahead of the game and already have hundreds of millions of doses. And that's really the objective of that. I think that's wise because the economic cost of even waiting a month or two is probably far more than that, probably in the hundreds of billions. You'll hear more about that. So that's what I wanted to share with you, that I would be hopeful that we are making progress on many fronts for this virus, and I'm very hopeful that we will be able to overcome this, but it's going to take time, and I plan on being in this sort of state that we are in probably through next summer, and if we're really lucky, then we can get beyond this by around that time. So I'll stop there, and if we have time for a few questions, we'll do that, and then maybe come back to other questions at the end.
Thank you, Deepak. We have several great questions coming in, so I want to remind everyone, if you have a specific question, please enter it in the lower left-hand corner, and we'll get to those as we can. And if you want to make sure and put your name on there, if we don't have time, then we will have Deepak follow up with you at the conclusion of the webinar. So, Deepak, the first one I want to ask is, the technology that you're speaking about from Gladstone, does that technology include lab review?
Lab review. So all the technologies are reviewed both internally, but then ultimately externally with our peers. And then anything that's going to clinical application, of course, goes through the FDA. And so, yes, all those things would be following that path.
Okay, and then how accurate are the existing mobile tests that provide immediate results today?
The existing rapid antigen test, which is what's the main rapid test that's used right now, is a good test in that it can give you the results quickly, but it's not very accurate. And so the estimates have ranged around 50%. And so there's been a whole debate, some of you might have seen in the press, about, maybe a bad test is better than no test if a test is taking 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 days. And so I think the FDA is leaning towards more rapid approval of tests that even if they aren't great, if they're rapid and can be done in the field, it will still be worthwhile.
Okay, and then I'll just ask you one more question before we turn it over to Caleb. What happens if the vaccines don't work?
So you're right, vaccines are difficult, can be difficult, and there's a possibility that we'll do all this and none of the ones will work. Then I think that's why I think it's really important to be pushing hard on treatments because, again, even if we don't have a vaccine that continues to spread, if we can just turn this into a bad flu, then that'll be enough to change the math on what we do with the economy. And then you just accept that there'll be a lot of people who get really sick, but there's not going to be hundreds of thousands dying. So we should be prepared for none of these vaccines to work because vaccines are hard. There are many viruses for which we still don't have a vaccine despite decades of effort.
Great, thank you. So we'll pause with the questions there, but I want to remind you again, keep entering them, and we'll get to more after we hear from Caleb Silsby. He's Whittier Trust Chief Portfolio Manager. Thank you, Caleb.
Good morning. Thank you so much, Deepak. That was a great overview and amazing to hear that we are creating 100 million doses of multiple vaccine attempts and, without knowing that they will fully work. So that's happening with advances in the medical field. It's also happening across the broader economy. While we have a lot of time in isolation ourselves as individuals, the innovation and human adaptation that is occurring is remarkable. And so in some cases, it feels like we're running in place at warp speed, meaning that the advances in medical technology and then also technology in terms of, work from home and also, the advances in e-commerce are occurring so quickly and so rapidly that it's really remarkable. So we have a number of interesting slides to go through. I'll jump right into it. The first slide shows the wide dispersion in returns that we've seen this year. So the theme is that this is no ordinary recession, and typically in a recession there are no beneficiaries or few beneficiaries. In this case, there are a few beneficiaries that are just giants, and so you can see the tech sector up 24% year to date, while airlines down in the 40s and the energy sector down in the 30s. And so energy airlines really showing very little signs of recovery here, and yet the S&P 500 up for the year, up 5% for the year. So you've been following the headlines, where 54 million Americans at one point this year have lost their jobs. And while many have regained their jobs, it is remarkable to see the stock market up this year. So beneath the surface, you can see that, again, energy and airlines down, small cap down 9%. So small and medium-sized businesses much more challenged in this environment. And if you exclude the U.S., the all-world index down 5%. So while we talk about the stock market being up for the year, there are many, many companies that are still down for the year at this point. The next slide is extremely important in that there was a very strong correlation between the interest rates and the movement of interest rates and then the movement of the stock market. And that correlation has broken down, and we're now seeing a very wide dispersion. So the green line is the S&P 500 total return, which fell precipitously in February and March. The 10-year Treasury yield also fell, and as the Federal Reserve cut interest rates, the 10-year Treasury yield approached 50 basis points. You can see the stock market, the S&P 500, has recovered, and yet the 10-year Treasury yield is still around 60 basis points. So this is very important. There are two key implications here. One is that the bond market is perhaps a little less optimistic about the recovery of the broader economy, meaning that the bond market is, the Treasury market is not seeing signs of inflation or expecting the Federal Reserve to raise interest rates anytime soon as the economy recovers. Whereas you can see the stock market is I'd say more optimistic if you look at the high level. Again, because of the dispersion in returns that we've seen, this is more about the sectors within the stock market than anything else. The other key implication is that the Federal Reserve has been so aggressive in keeping interest rates low that even while the stock market begins to anticipate the recovery that will occur once a vaccine is in place, the bond market, Fed has been so aggressive in keeping interest rates low that that's actually supported valuations for the stock market. And so looking deeper into the bond market, is it really that the bond market is not expecting this recovery like the stock market is eventually? This chart tells the next story, which is around credit spreads. So a credit spread is if the U.S. government can borrow at, let's say, 1%, then how much does American Airlines have to pay on their debt, or how much does Apple have to pay on their debt? So this is an aggregate number, taking all the corporations and saying how much additional interest payments are they going to have to make over the Treasury. So of course, in recessions, credit spreads widen out and spike up. You can see in the Great Financial Crisis that this hit almost 600 basis points. And in this crisis, it started to spike up, hitting a level not seen since the Great Financial Crisis, but then has quickly snapped back to very low levels in line with where it was just prior to this current crisis. So this tells you that the bond market, while the 10-year Treasury is at a very low interest rate, because credit spreads are so tight, it's saying that the market will eventually recover. And another interpretation of this is that the Federal Reserve is being so aggressive, they're keeping interest rates low, and they're manipulating credit spreads to be lower than they normally would in a recession. So this chart shows the Federal Reserve's balance sheet. And you can see in the financial crisis in 2008 and 2009, the response at that time was massive, where the Federal Reserve expanded their balance sheet by $1 trillion. That was quantitative easing one. And you can see in red here, the COVID-19 response dwarfs that. So it's $3 trillion in terms of expanding the balance sheet. This has enormous implications for liquidity in the market. And that's why credit spreads are much lower than they've been in previous recessions, and why interest rates are much lower than they've been in previous recessions. So that's the monetary policy response. Very dramatic, has a huge impact on the market. The fiscal response, also staggering. In the second quarter, the deficit for the federal government was about $2.8 trillion, which roughly equals the GDP of Austria, Denmark, Ireland, Switzerland, Singapore, Hong Kong, Taiwan, all combined. So that's the annual GDP of those 8 countries roughly equals just that 1 quarter deficit. And so you might look at this and say, well, the U.S. is out of control versus the rest of the world. That borrowing is staggering. If you look at it relative to GDP, so it's about 11% of GDP. That's in line with France. It's actually smaller than the UK. Singapore was more than 20% of GDP, and Japan borrowed more than 40% of GDP just in that second quarter. So amazing to see the stimulus that's occurred there. Tying the two of these together, you can see in the Great Financial Crisis, the light line here is the budget deficit, and it reached as a percent of GDP about 10% in the financial crisis. And as I said, the Federal Reserve balance sheet went up by $1 trillion. So you can see that those two lines are in tandem. This next slide, same scale, but the current crisis, the budget deficit much higher, around 14% of GDP, and the Federal Reserve balance sheet almost hitting 35%, so hitting 33% of GDP. So when the government is borrowing, the Federal Reserve is adding liquidity to the system, printing money, and allowing the government to borrow without seeing interest rates spike up or the currency materially devalue. So the enormous policy response from the Federal Reserve and from the federal government has allowed for what is the race for the $2 trillion market cap. amazingly, and you know, your grandparents told you that the first trillion would be the hardest, right? The old adage that the first trillion is always the hardest. So it took Apple 38 years to reach $1 trillion in market cap, and just 2 years to hit, it's almost at $2 trillion. Perhaps by the time this is replayed, Apple will be at $2 trillion. So amazing to see that when you lower interest rates and you lower credit spreads and you add a lot of liquidity to the system, at the same time that there are fundamental drivers that are improving the business, meaning that every kid who's staying at home and not going to school, the parents are upgrading their laptop or their computer. And if you're at home a lot, you're not going to have an old iPhone, you're going to have a new iPhone. So all the fundamental drivers are there, but valuations have also ticked up for some of these technology giants that are benefiting from this environment. We're seeing this boom in e-commerce. So just in the last 3 months, we've seen 10 years worth of growth in e-commerce. The USPS in the news for a number of other reasons recently, but seeing 40% year-over-year growth, UPS over 10%, FedEx almost 20%. So there is a real boom here. And what's sort of shocking is we're actually running out of industrial space for distribution and fulfillment centers. And so you saw the news headline the other day where Amazon was talking with Simon Property Group about turning old JCPenney stores and Sears into fulfillment centers. So here's a very tragic picture of an abandoned mall. There are many of these across the country, but the creativity and the adaptation of humans in this environment to, you know, think about this as a distribution center and a fulfillment center. Within real estate, the other amazing story here is that the home ownership rate has skyrocketed. So, you know, people care more about their own personal space, and they're spending a lot of time at home. So they don't want to put a lot into a rental if they're going to, you know, have a home office. And so the home ownership rate has spiked up to levels almost on par with where it was in 2004, 2005 at the height of the housing bubble. So this is a remarkable chart spanning many decades where there was a long-term trend in forcing or pushing higher home ownership rates. Then there was a decade-long belief that millennials would rent rather than own, and they wanted to have experiences over things, and they wanted to live in a city near public transportation. Well, we're seeing this reverse. Those millennials are a bit older now, and they want a white picket fence in the yard and a place to store their kids' bike. So not only are people buying, but they're also building, and they're improving their home. They're building a home office. The price of lumber has skyrocketed 170%. Just incredible. But real estate is performing great here. You can see that while industrial up 10%, and we talked about that because Amazon, you know, really trying to have a land grab here to take as much large-scale industrial projects as possible for fulfillment centers. But you can see residential down, office down, and here when we say residential, it's mostly multifamily apartment buildings. So while single family is up, multifamily and apartment buildings are down about 20%. And then you can see office, as you would expect, and retail down significantly. What's interesting here is from April to today, there are really no signs of the market anticipating the recovery there. The market is continuing to price in struggles for those sub-asset classes. So I want to highlight the difference between single-family and multifamily. Single-family homes, the home that you live in, versus multifamily being apartments. They generally tend to move in tandem, and as rents go up in apartments, home prices go up. And then you can see in March of this year, the anticipation was that rents would fall, and the market thought that single-family homes would fall as well. And then since April, we've seen this enormous dispersion, 25% dispersion, where single-family is actually up for the year, while multifamily apartments down 20%. Within the multifamily apartment space, it's even more interesting because people are living in the picture on the left, this beautiful green belt, two-story walk-up, separate entrance. If you have your own personal space, even though you're living in an apartment, and that's what you can afford at that time, versus that sort of space age, downtown, high-rise, close to public transportation, amenity-driven rents where the public pool and the hot tub would force higher rents just a year ago, 2 years ago. Today, people are moving out of those apartments. So while the broad multifamily apartment market is down year to date, you can see that the two-story walk-up separate entrance apartments are actually doing very well, and the economics work extremely well now that interest rates have declined as much as they have. Just recently, Essex, which is a multifamily REIT, borrowed money for 10 years at below 2% interest rate. So you can imagine that in a cap rate environment of 4%, when you're borrowing at less than 2%, the economics work pretty well. So talked about many ways that this is an abnormal recession with fairly extreme moves beneath the surface. But in some ways, it is still a normal recession in the sense that banks are afraid to lend. So if you look at on the left-hand side of this chart, the gray shaded area, that's the great financial crisis, 2008, 2009, where lending standards tightened dramatically. And then on the far right, you're seeing lending standards tighten again in some subsectors at similar levels. So while credit spreads are low and the bond market has a lot of liquidity, banks are still very concerned about extending loans to small and medium-sized businesses and real estate operators. And then it's justified. If you look at default rates, despite the fact that credit spreads are low, default rates are expected to be on par with the great financial crisis. So double digits this year and double digits next year. Those are the green bars down at the bottom. The default rate, according to Moody's Analytics, expected to be double digits 2 years in a row. And that compares to the financial crisis of single digits in 2008 and then double digits in 2009. So to tie it all together, this is no ordinary recession. There's a rapid change that's occurring in the medical field as well as in the broad economy. The asset price inflation and low interest rates are a result of aggressive monetary policy. And there's a lot of talk about if the Fed is adding money to the system, will it cause inflation? And the lessons learned over the last 10 years is it causes inflation in asset prices, but not necessarily the real economy. Wages are still going to be relatively low, relatively capped, but you will see higher valuations because interest rates are so very low. Then necessity is driving innovation and a boom in e-commerce and data centers, cloud, and surprisingly, the single-family home market. Real estate is adapting, so both the demand and purpose of real estate are adapting in this environment. And we talked about how banks are reluctant to lend. I will leave you with two thoughts. One is that there's virtually no opportunity cost because the Fed has lowered rates so much. So this quote that says, teach your kids about compounding. Put your money in a savings account and watch it double every 19,876 years. Really puts it in perspective how low interest rates are, and that has very significant implications for how you invest in this environment. Not all hope is lost. We picked out a number of companies and sectors where the yield today is actually higher than the yield at the beginning of the year. We looked at a preferred stock of U.S. Bank, a high-quality regional bank, looked at the REITs that we talked about, and then AT&T and JP Morgan, Intel. Each of those companies has their own challenges, but the yield is higher than it was at the beginning of the year. So I'll leave the disclosures up to make our attorneys happy. It's 11 o'clock on the dot. Happy to answer questions. Thank you for your time this morning.
Great, thank you, Caleb. So I think we're going to have Deepak log back on. Deepak, are you available? So while we're getting him logged back in, Caleb, let's go with a question for you. So as Deepak spoke earlier, vaccines are hard, and there are many viruses that have no vaccine after decades of research and trials. What is Plan B from an investment perspective?
It's a great question. I would say the market is very split between the secular winners and what I would call recovery stocks, right? Recovery stocks would be stocks that will do well when the vaccine is in place. And highlighted a couple charts that the market really isn't pricing in the recovery of those stocks, right? The airlines are still very low in terms of valuation. The banks, the cruise ships, the restaurants, the hotels, all those businesses that are being hit the hardest are, I would call those recovery stocks. The secular winners, the boom in e-commerce, the boom in data center, the boom in software, technology, work from home, all of that, will continue to win if the vaccine is either delayed or does not come to fruition. So we are still positioned to be, overweight the secular winners. We are not yet betting on the recovery from that standpoint. But if that is the case, if you are worried the vaccine will not come, then even these stocks that are still trading well below where they were at the beginning of the year carry a fair amount of risk. And the risk is that the vaccine does not come through. So if that's your concern, then I would avoid that side of it. We're optimistic that, organizations like Gladstone and people like Deepak and human ingenuity will lead to a successful vaccine. There's so much in terms of resources that are being thrown at this. And I think the most incredible part of Deepak's talk is that there are multiple vaccines where there's 100 million doses being produced before the stage 3 trial. That's just incredible. So I would say if you're worried about that, then you stick with the secular winners. If you think that human ingenuity will prevail, then some of these stocks that are more beaten down but have the potential to come back and be stronger after the crisis are worth a look. We just think it's a little early for that.
Great, thank you. So Deepak, let me ask you a question. Excuse me. Has there been any progress on who, besides those that have existing risk factors, may be more susceptible than others to catch the virus?
Yeah, it's a really good question because it's been still quite a conundrum why some people will get so sick they'll die, and then 40% won't have any symptoms at all. And it's likely to have something to do with the person's own immune system that we don't fully understand. Other people clearly are more susceptible, so there may be some component of aging of the immune system. There have been theories about related to past vaccines people have gotten that have cross-reactivity, but I think the answer is still unknown. If I could say one other thing that related to the previous discussion on the vaccine, the FDA has now been clear about what will constitute approval criteria, and it's probably good for you guys to know. If a vaccine is safe and it is only 50% effective, it's going to get approved. So in the trials, if it reduces the infection rate in a population that's been inoculated by 50%, which is not a lot, that's going to get approved. So I'd say the likelihood of approval for some of these is high because that's not a high bar. We'll need a better vaccine if that's all we got with this, but in terms of the enthusiasm and the people's feelings of some approval, I think the likelihood is high.
Great, thank you. And so someone caught on that you said you think next summer is when we'll have some solutions for this. So they were asking if your prediction is more likely than the end of the year.
End of this year? Yeah, so in the best case scenario, by the end of this year, we'll have a readout of 2 trials that will finish their phase 3, which is 30,000 people inoculated. We will have purchased initial doses, which is great, but people are going to need 2 doses of which whatever works. And in the first quarter of 2021, the high-risk folks would be inoculated first. So healthcare workers, elderly, will go through that group first. And then by the second quarter, start inoculating others. So it would be this summer. If you do that math, march it out, it's the next summer before a good portion of the population in the United States, at least, is vaccinated. Not before then.
Okay, great. So I'm going to ask Deepak another question, and then we'll wrap up with one that can be posed for both of you. Any comment on the announcement from Russia about having their vaccine ready?
Yeah, it's an interesting approach that is unconventional. They have their vaccine that they've been developing has gone through a phase 2 trial. So trials are phase 1 is a small group of people, 40 or 50, to see if it's safe and if you get some antibody response. Phase 2 is a bit more than that, a couple of thousand maybe, and they've done that. Phase 3, as I mentioned, is 30,000. Russia hasn't done that, but they have a vaccine that's been through phase 2, like many others, and they've said, well, for high-risk folks, we at least know it's probably safe, so we're going to go ahead and give it to those folks while we still do the phase 3 trial. It's not that they're not doing it, but they're just speeding up those who get it. So I think their military, healthcare workers, select populations are getting it.
Great, thank you. And so the question I want to pose to both of you, and you guys can figure out who's going to go first, is what have we learned over the last 6 months that will make us better prepared for the next pandemic in terms of viruses and things like that, and then likewise on the investment front?
Maybe I'll lead on the science front. So I think that's a great question, and I alluded to that at the very beginning, that we should be thinking about the future. There will be more. So I think we've learned a lot about what we need in terms of stockpiles, what we need in terms of testing. I think a number of the tests, like the one we're developing, within 3 to 4 weeks, we will be able to flip that for the next virus, whatever it is, and it'll be immediate. Same thing with potentially the vaccine approach. So I think we've learned a lot about taking it seriously. I think in the future, people probably won't be shaking hands very much for a long time. I think if you get a cold and you're coughing and sneezing, you'll probably be wearing a mask or not go to work at all. And that's what they've been doing in Asia for a long time. The SARS and MERS experiences in Asia prepared them better than we were prepared because it was more real to them than those were to us. That's a fundamental difference in the responses of many of the Asian countries compared to how we responded.
Yeah, and from a corporate perspective or an investment perspective, there's a couple things. One is that I think when people make hiring decisions, they're going to make different hiring decisions in the sense that when you are managing a team of employees and everybody's in the office together, it's easier to have control over what those employees are doing. When everybody's working remotely, there's a much larger trust factor. And so from a hiring decision perspective, you really have to make sure that you're hiring somebody that you can trust in the absence of hands-on management. They often say that the culture of the company is what you do when nobody is looking. So that just becomes even more important. And then I would say that this crisis would have been much, much worse from an economic perspective if we had not gone through the financial crisis in 2008 and 2009. And it would be much, much worse if we had not seen the rise of e-commerce over the last 20 years. So the lessons that we learned from the financial crisis in terms of the Federal Reserve coming in with aggressive policy actions to add liquidity to a market that they can freeze up. And then imagine what this crisis would have looked like if we didn't have e-commerce built out. The lines that you saw at Costco for hour and a half outside the door, that would have been every day at every store, and the virus would have transferred even faster than it did. So I'd say it's building on the lessons that we've learned from the emergence of e-commerce and from the financial crisis, being even more, being confirmed in this crisis. And then also going forward, the hiring decision is even more important to make sure that that if you're in a work from home environment, that you're going to have very productive employees, and that's going to help the business. So.
Great, thank you. We want to conclude now and thank everyone for joining us, and we will be following up with an email that will have the recording and the slides. So if you have any further questions, you can contact your person at Whittier Trust. Otherwise, we thank you, and stay safe, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. This does conclude today's conference. We thank you for your participation. You may connect your lines at this time and have a wonderful day.